Record. All right. Hello, everybody. Hope you guys are doing well. I don't think there's much in the way of housekeeping to touch on. You guys should all be in touch with your mentors. I had class with them last night, and things were going are going well. Two small points that came up last night, but are just good to touch on. One, if through communication with myself or Dr. G or Dr. Kohane, you are doing an assignment that is slightly different than how the assignment is prescribed or what has been typically done in the past, just make sure that you can communicate that with your mentor so that they know format-wise that whatever you are turning in is okay. We've had a couple people have been given carve-outs on an assignment here or there, and we're getting questions from the mentors about that, and it's been cleared up and it's fine. But just communicate that on the front end. Second thing, make sure that you are, especially at this point, staying in touch with your mentors. If you are, I know that with this class, there's kind of, it's like, you know, a couple of weeks where things kind of come in slow, and then the floodgates open, and you have a lot to do all at once, and it kind of keeps up for a while. So if especially now at the start, if you are feeling those floodgates still rushing out and you are behind on an assignment or two, that's okay. Be in touch with your mentors and communicate with them. I don't want lack of communication to be a point of contention at this point in the semester. I never want it to be a point of contention, but especially at this point in the semester, I really, 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 really want you guys to be okay with and be comfortable reaching out and saying, hey, things got crazy this week. I'm a little bit behind on my research summary. I'll get it to you by this date. And you give that date to your mentors and stick to it, but get off on the right foot in terms of communication with them. And by the same token, make sure that they are getting off on the right foot in terms of communication with you. I believe they've all been in close contact with you or reached out a couple of times or set meetings or whatever it may be, but just make sure that is working in both directions in an appropriate way, okay? Are there any questions or concerns, or does anyone need any clarification on mentor-mentee relationships right now? Nope. Okay, sounds good. Next week, we are obviously off for our not Mardi Gras, and we will be returning in 2 weeks after tonight. And I think, yeah, data collections are kind of right around the corner. Obviously, if you need more time, the due dates on data collections are a little bit more flexible than on things like research summaries and the quizzes. So if you need more time, you're collecting more data, that's fine. But again, be in touch with your mentor or with us. No worries, Heather. Just to kind of make sure that you're in good shape. Okay, sound good? All right, cool. Let's go ahead and jump right in. So this week we are talking about, Taylor's question, have we determined who's doing what selected reading presentations? You know what? I will admit that I have not checked those signups. I will get with Dr. G after class tonight and just really to make sure that there isn't overlap on the chapters that you guys have selected, and we'll get that that finalized to you by the end of the week. All right. So I apologize. Assume that what you signed up for is what you are going to be able to do, but especially if it's sooner. If it's later, don't start it just yet so that we can clarify that. Okay. Cool. All right. Repertoires of teachers who are behavior analysts. So this is a cool chapter for a number of reasons. It's it's a chapter that even without having read DTS at this point in the, not the semester, but in the program, you guys have a little bit of familiarity with the content vis-a-vis the ranks, right? So this chapter is all about repertoires of teachers who are behavior analysts, so contingency-shaped repertoires, verbally mediated repertoires, and verbal behavior about the science. And what I want to focus on tonight is how those three repertoires, a little bit less on what they are, we'll talk about that some obviously, but more so how they interact with each other, how they're independent of each other, and what function they each serve. All right, so that's kind of the outline of the conversation for tonight. So starting at the beginning, starting with some definitions. We have verbal behavior about the science. We have contingency-shaped repertoires. 15 years later, that's still a mouthful for me to say. I always get tongue-tied when I say that. And we have verbal behavior verbally mediated repertoires. So who wants to take a stab at some definition of verbal behavior about the science? What does that mean to you?
Okay, I'll go. I'll give it a shot. Go ahead, Cece. Okay, thanks, Dr. Shanman. I think it means, applying what you're doing in the classroom to a principle, to a tactic. You're increasing your verbal repertoire in terms of behavior analysis and the science of behavior. Good.
So what I think that the definition, a definition of verbal behavior about the science is encapsulated in what you just said. I think what you just provided probably goes a little bit bigger than the definition of verbal behavior about the science. So what part of the definition, hello, Heather, what part of that definition that Cece just provided specifically speaks to verbal behavior about the science? Or if someone else wants to put in their own definition, that's fine too. Tanya, I see you. You're ready. You want to try. I see it.
My house is kind of crazy. They're installing carpet above me. Zone, so I'm gonna probably stay a little bit quiet.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay, who wants to give it a shot? Verbal behavior about the science. Go ahead, Taylor. Can barely hear you. There we go. Yeah.
It's like your textbook definitions of what we do, why we do, and then taking that and applying it.
Okay, good. So, and that application part, which Cece mentioned as well, I think that's the part that's going a little bit too far when we're talking about verbal behavior about the science. To me, verbal behavior about the science is really just the language. It's the definitions, it's the tax, it's the intraverbal responses of the science of behavior analysis, right? So when I can rattle off the definition of positive reinforcement, that is part of the verbal behavior about the science, right? That doesn't say anything about my ability to identify positive reinforcement. That doesn't say anything about my ability to use positive reinforcement. It is truly just being able to speak the language in context and appropriately. All right. Why might it not be necessary to have that applied aspect when we are talking about verbal behavior about science? Why is application not or not a part of that? And I don't want you to be thinking about an answer to that question or be thinking about that question in a context of why it can't be a part of that. All right. There's absolutely a way for me to look at verbal behavior about the science and include an applied aspect of it. But I don't think that that is a necessary component of verbal behavior about the science.
They're quiet at the moment. I think, you know, it allows us to communicate fluently, have us understood with each other. And, you know, like I met with Dr. Cohen the other day, and she's trying to drag that out of me. I still want to do teacher talk. And, you know, she's like, what's that called? And it was, she was asking for TAC. It was something really simple, but I was referring to it totally differently. So that fluid communication, having others understand what we're talking about and understanding what they're talking about is, you know, what I get with the verbal behavior about the science.
Perfect. And I think that that's exactly the point. Verbal behavior about the science is really about communication, right? We are a technical field. We have these very precise definitions that we understand with a specific meaning. And when I think of verbal behavior about the science, and the reason I remove the applied aspect of it is that this domain to me is really about appropriate usage of the language as a prerequisite for application. All right. If you are not fluent in the precise language, you will not be able to intentionally apply any of that language because you won't know that that language has that meaning, right? So when you're talking about a tact is one 4-letter word that has a string of words attached to it definition wise. And when we say tact, we are talking about very specific contingencies. We're talking about very specific behaviors, talking about specific reinforcers, specific antecedents, specific motivating conditions, specific instructional history, specific function. It goes on and on and on and on. And that's a lot of language incorporated into that one word, right? Knowing the definition of tact says absolutely nothing about your ability to implement a tact. It's necessary to implement a tact, but it is not in and of itself predictive of facilitating, I guess is a better word, a tact. So when we're talking about the verbal behavior about the science, I think looking at it in terms of communication amongst each other, that's the primary function, all right? Really making sure that we as a behavior analytic community are able to communicate our precise terminology with each other with common meanings, all right? There are plenty of examples within behavior analysis where we can see that precision and that verbal behavior actually gets in the way and causes problems. But because we have that level of precision, it allows for conversation and dialogue around those problems to exist. Last class that I was with you guys 2 weeks ago, we spoke about the Learn Unit. And one of the questions, I believe it was Taylor's group's question, was what's the difference between the Learn Unit and a discrete trial, right? Those, and we had a great conversation around that, and I think we all feel pretty comfortable about that. But now we went from not a layman's understanding, but a pre-verbal behavior understanding of what a Learn Unit was to a post-verbal behavior understanding of what a Learn Unit is. And before we had the verbal behavior around the Learn Unit, discrete trial, three-term contingency, all kind of meant the same thing. Now that we have accurate verbal behavior around that tactic, that tool, that concept, that idea, we understand that those are separate tools that have separate definitions that are used in separate ways. That allows us to communicate with each other and to discuss and have conversations with each other around those ideas and those concepts. It says nothing about our ability to implement them, all right? So verbal behavior about the science has a function in its own right, but it is also a prerequisite skill for additional behaviors. Sound good? All right. Should I keep going, or does anyone have any questions about verbal behavior? We'll come back to it in multiple capacities over the course of the night. All right, cool. Definition-wise, continuing on. Contingency-shaped behaviors. What does that mean to you guys?
Okay. Like bike riding. You've experienced it, so you are able to perform that particular task or behavior.
Okay, good. What controls that behavior?
The antecedent and the consequence.
All right, good.
As a ABA therapist, we've been looking at the data, the student, what the students do, or what kind of performance, we're getting as to what behaviors we're going to go with and choose, kind of.
Okay. Lauren, going back to your comment, antecedent and the consequence. Why did I hesitate? You're not wrong, but why did I hesitate? I
assume there's probably a lot more than just that.
Well, yeah, yes, that is true, but
no, I don't know.
So yes, everything that you guys are talking about is accurate in one sense or another. Contingency shaped behavior to me is much more a conditioned respondent than a conditioned operant. That's not to say that, and I'll clarify. That's not to say that contingency shaped behaviors are not operant in that they are not taught. They are learned through principles of reinforcement. They are trained up, they are strengthened. But when we are talking about the repertoires of a teacher, to me, the contingency shaped behaviors are much more like stimulus response behaviors than operant behaviors. They are not governed by the presence or absence of reinforcement. They are governed by the presence of a stimulus. All right. we all like teaching. We all enjoy teaching. We enjoy working with kids. There's a lot of natural reinforcement built in to our days, the contingencies that we put in front of ourselves. But moment to moment, we're not always contacting reinforcement, right? There are days that we are very, very much, want to put the kid over there and get in the bed and go to sleep, right? Or watch TV or whatever it's going to be. But we still behave. We're not, in that moment, we're not behaving for a paycheck. We're not behaving because we're contacting natural reinforcement. We're not behaving for any of these more traditional reinforcers. And at the level that we are at and you guys are working to, you're not even behaving just because you're supposed to, right? You're behaving because it's automatic. A contingency is presenting itself, and you are just responding. To me, contingency-shaped behavior is behavior that occurs without thought. Behavior that occurs without thought can't only be governed by consequences. It can be shaped by consequences, but it can't only be governed by consequences. Do you guys, Lauren, does that make sense? How the reinforcer isn't necessarily part of that contingency? Okay, cool. And I think that that's really important, because you get to a point where when you start looking at layering the different repertoires that we are talking about, where you're not necessarily contacting reinforcement for using the verbal behavior about the science. It's just automatic. It's second nature. It is respondent. It is stimulus response. All right. So what significance or what role do contingency-shaped behaviors play in the repertoires of teachers? Why is it important to consider these repertoires?
It's a measure of effective teaching, how effective their teaching is.
Good. And you can get measures of effective teaching
through TPRAs and learn units to crit and then learn unit total. I'm thinking of the components of the rank for that section.
Yep. Good. Exactly.
Which I do have a question about.
I'm gonna once we've gone through all three, I'm gonna start over and tie it back in through the ranks. So we're definitely gonna get to that. But where I'm getting held up is the ranks, and the language that you're using is accurate to the tool that you're referring to. So you're talking about the measure of an effective teacher vis-a-vis the rank, which is a measurement tool, right? But I want you to look at contingency-shaped repertoires as not the measurement of an effective teacher, but the behavior of an effective teacher. All right, the rank is a measure of that behavior, but the repertoire itself is just that. It is the behavior. Okay, So contingency shaped responding is behavior of an effective teacher. Why is that a behavior of effective teachers?
Could it be, Dr. Shaman, that maybe a teacher becomes more proficient in reinforcing behaviors that we want to see versus reinforcing punitive behaviors?
Yeah. So in following that line, the way that I would look at that is if positive reinforcement is for desired behaviors is a contingency shaped repertoire, then that teacher is going to be more effective in delivering positive reinforcement to or for target behaviors for increase, and effective in not delivering reinforcement for other behaviors, right? If you extend that to punishment, if you have a teacher who delivers punishment as part of a contingency shaped repertoire, then they are appropriately delivering punishment for behaviors to decrease and not delivering punishment for behaviors to increase, right? Extend that to the next concept, extend that to the next concept. And as the contingency shaped repertoires expand, then the teacher becomes more effective. One measure of that might be learning units delivered, learning units criterion, so on and so forth, as Taylor pointed out. All right, so what we are looking for is an expansion of that contingency shaped repertoire. And when we get to the rank, you'll hopefully see how this all works together. And what I want you to be already thinking about is what is the relationship between contingency shaped and verbal behavior about the science. All right, so don't answer that yet, but start thinking about that already. Okay, third repertoire, verbally mediated behavior. What is verbally mediated behavior? Who wants to take a stab?
Is this where we're looking at that application?
No. Someone try.
I feel like this is the component whenever you can actually talk about everything and explain things. Like it's rapid data presentations, I think, and
that's part of it. So I think kind of like what Taylor did with contingency shaped. I told you I can't spit that out. What Taylor did with contingency shaped, when you look at the rank, you're looking at the measurement of, right? You're not necessarily looking at the behavior itself. So when we do rapid data presentations, when we do talk about what happened in those graphs, when we do data collections, what is it that we are measuring? And don't say verbally mediated behavior. What is it that we are actually measuring? All right, I'm going to start leading you guys to the answer. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I don't know. Or measuring target behaviors.
Okay, so do we do graph shares, do we do data collections on a program where we implemented the Learn Unit, the child learned, we had 3 consecutive ascending data paths, and we put a check, and then we got 2 more data paths, and then we got to criterion. Do we do data collections or decision analyses on a graph like that? Generally speaking, not have we ever, but generally speaking, is that the type of graph that we would do an analysis of? Taylor, you shook your head. Why?
It's too simple.
Okay, it's too simple. What is that simplicity?
The trend is
There's learning taking place.
Okay.
For the student, I mean, and for a teacher, but there would be learning taking place. We typically present the more troublesome graphs in a way, something that we're kind of stuck where we need to research, find new tactics.
Okay.
Problem solve.
You glossed over the teacher component, but go back to that. Look at it from a teacher perspective. And you just started to do that to some degree. Things that we need to research, things that we need to problem solve, things that we need to analyze. We don't look at those. So, and Cece's saying it tells the teacher, the data tell the teacher to continue, right? That is contingency shaped decision making. You are responding directly to the contingency. Taylor, what you're talking about is decision making, like analytical decision making. That's what verbally mediated behavior is. Verbally mediated behavior is when the contingencies that are in front of us don't tell us the answer. Verbally mediated behavior is when we need to, either through research, through combining multiple behaviors, or some other level of analysis, we have to create the decision, the behavior. Verbally mediated decision making is when you go to your BCBA, when your BCBA goes to the research, when you go to the research, when you can't just rely on the contingencies that are in front of you plus the instructional history to make a decision. That's verbally mediated behavior. All right, and it's challenging. That's the hard part, right? That's what you guys are training to be able to do, is to make those verbally mediated decisions. And your ability to do that is really what's going to define your success within this field, right? So now, given that idea and that statement, let's take it back. Let's look at, and Taylor, I shot you down when you said applied. It still doesn't speak to correctness, right? It's just decision making. So now we have the language, we have automatic behaviors, and we have these verbally mediated repertoires where we are making decisions based on not simply the contingencies that are in front of us, but these other higher order levels, which we'll talk about in a second. How do all 3 of these interact? We've kind of already discussed how they're separate, right? But how do they interact? How do they work with one another? I'll give you a hint. You guys have said the answer 5 times, and I've said no to it each time. So now's the time. They interact through application. All right? when you have the language to identify what is happening in front of you. That is verbal behavior about the science, interacting with contingency-shaped behavior to have, and the effect of that is a meaningful, repeatable output. All right, application. If you are simply responding to the contingencies, you are not necessarily going to have consistent application because you don't have the language. If you have the language, that doesn't mean that you are going to consistently respond to the contingencies. But when you have both, you are able to, because you are able to communicate about it, because really you are able to emit speakers on listener behavior and communicate with yourself about it, you are able to apply with more consistency. How many of you can remember the first time, and it doesn't have to be the first time this one thing happened, but the first time for any tact, for any verbal behavior about the science, you saw it and said, that's the thing. That's positive reinforcement. That's a tact. That's a mand. That's a whatever. How many of you can remember seeing it for the first time, seeing it and being able to tact it for the first time? Does anyone relate to that? For me, the one that sticks out to in my mind was I had a kid that we were actually doing intensive tact with. And he was a pretty social kid, but it was a lot of faulty verbal behavior. And he looked outside and looked right at me and said, "Mr. Shanman, balloon." And that was it. He didn't want a token. He didn't want the balloon. He didn't want an edible. He was interacting with me to tell me, look at what I see. And I said, tact. Like I tacted that was a tact. And that was like, that was a huge moment for me, right? That was when I was able to really see, like I knew that the verbal behavior was there. I knew that I was seeing positive reinforcement. I knew I was seeing these other things. But when I was in that moment, able to identify that specific thing and everything around it, I then knew I could use that, apply that in future situations appropriately and accurately. It's that combination, it's those two things interacting together that speaks to accuracy and application. All right. How do verbal behavior and contingency shaped behaviors interact with verbally mediated behavior? Any thoughts? You guys are too quiet tonight. Everyone's quiet. My last class was quiet. My class last night wasn't quiet. They're never quiet. How do verbal behavior about the science and contingency-shaped behavior interact with verbally mediated behavior? So the way that I see this, you want to try? Someone want to try?
I was off camera for I lost y'all for a little bit when I was relocating, but I mean, you really have to be fluent in all of them to be effective. I mean, that's
okay. Good. I want you've all worked with line techs, you've all worked with paraprofessionals, you've all worked with BCBAs. You've all worked with master teachers. So I think I've covered both clinic and school setting. There are some people, all of those individuals should be able to have conversations about their discipline, right? But the level of expertise of a line technician or a beginning RBT or an early paraprofessional, that of a BCBA or a master teacher are very different, right? You get to the verbal behavior plus contingency shaped behavior is only going to get you so far, right? That decision-making process is what's going to allow you to extend your own repertoire. And once you get into that verbally mediated repertoire, it brings everything along with it, right? Verbally mediated behaviors can allow for contingencies that extend your verbal behavior, that extend your contingency shaped repertoires, that lead to new practices that can be wrapped in and become contingency shaped. And it just keeps going and going and going. All right. None of these repertoires are static repertoires, but it requires all three to expand all three. Right? If you have verbal behavior about the science, that verbal behavior about the science can build on itself and extend its verbal behavior. If you read a technical book on any discipline, you can get the basic vocabulary. You can then read the next book and the next book and the next book and the next book. And your verbal behavior can increase significantly as a result. But so you can have all of that, but that's not going to say anything about your contingency shaped. It's not going to say anything about your verbally mediated, and it's not going to say anything about your application. So two, if you are taught how to do a skill, but you're not taught how to talk about it, you're not taught how to make decisions, you can get better and better and better and better and better at that skill. I think a good example of that are paraprofessionals who have been in school districts for a really, 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 really long time, right? Those paras can run circles around many, many teachers in terms of how well they can do one or another skill. They are the best at classroom management. They are the best at delivering a particular type of instruction. They are the best at this. They are the best at that. But that's the limit. That's the limit, because they don't have the verbal behavior and they don't have the tools to get this verbally mediated behavior, because they don't have the verbal behavior to go with, so on and so forth. So you can extend that contingency shaped behavior. There's a limit. There's a horizontal limit, not a vertical limit. Verbally mediated behavior you can't have without the other two. Verbally mediated behavior requires verbal behavior and contingency shaped behavior to get there. But once you have it, it allows you to, without guidance, I would say, extend the other two. Your verbally mediated behavior creates this self-fulfilling loop, or self-perpetuating loop of growth within any discipline, if it's used at all, right? If it's not just appropriately, but if it has to be used. So when you put yourself, if you have that background, if you have that language, if you've emitted some of those contingency shaped behaviors, that allows you to get into this position where you can start making decisions and learn new things and build new repertoires, and they become contingency shaped, and then you can make new decisions, and so on and so forth. I've worked with a very limited number of kids over the past 6 or 7 years since I graduated, right? My understanding of behavior analysis has grown exponentially in that time because of what I came in with, the level of verbal behavior about science, contingency shaped behavior, and verbally mediated behavior that I entered that time period with. So despite not being in the trenches practicing, increasing my contingency shaped behaviors, my verbally mediated behavior has allowed for all three repertoires to grow exponentially. And so is the case with you guys. You guys all come into this program with backgrounds as line technicians, backgrounds as teachers. You have some experience with the verbal behavior. Many of you are RBTs. You have really good contingency shaped behavior. What you were missing was your verbally mediated behavior. And for some of you, your supervisors, your BCBAs had started to engender that with you. And through that, you started performing new tasks. You were pulled off of a client. You started to program. You started to do different things. That's your verbally mediated behavior. The direct contingencies that were in front of you are not what dictated how you behaved in those ways. You guys see what I'm talking about there? When you are able to make those decisions, that's where growth as a behavior analyst really occurs. All right. So let's take those three categories and tie them back in to the ranks. So how do the ranks, the teacher ranks, measure verbal behavior about the science?
We have quizzes.
We have quizzes. What is the critical attribute of those quizzes?
You have to pass the mastery criterion. You have
Exactly.
to show a fluent understanding.
Perfect. Absolutely right. You demonstrate mastery, and hopefully you demonstrate fluency, right? But absolutely mastery. I'll leave that there. What is the measurement of contingency shaped behavior? We already talked about it a little bit, but again.
Like directly from the rank. I think it's like 15 to 20 consecutive days of a certain learn unit goal.
Okay.
Being responsible for a student reaching criterion on a program or programs within so many learn units to criterion.
Mm-hmm.
And the matrix component. It's different per module, but it's requiring TPRAs on certain components. So like classroom management, assessing, academic, communication, different areas in terms of like, for us, the LCAR.
Good. And yeah, CC, so the TPRAs and supervisor observations that end up tying into that matrix are a huge component of that. Good. So how are those used as measures of contingency shaped repertoires? Why is that an appropriate measure? And we spoke about it a little bit earlier, but I want you guys to be able to reiterate that.
I mean, those behaviors should be automatic. Running learn units should be automatic. Running them at a rate that is necessary for the student you're with in order for them to attain mastery should be an automatic behavior.
Good.
And then the TPRA would be the supervision component, showing that you have efficiency in doing those.
Okay, excellent. Cece, how, expand on that. I think I know what you're saying, but I want you to articulate that. Opposite of an artifact.
All right. Can you hear me or?
Yeah,
what?
yeah. You
Can you hear
paused
me?
for a second, but you're there. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, so I honestly, I just recall reading in the chapter the difference between an artifact and what is a not an artifact, and I can't remember now, but I do recall understanding that the reason they don't use something, it's because artifacts cannot really be measured. There's no, like, for example,
Let me pause you for a sec. Let me help you out a little bit. So in the world of education, how do, what is one of, I think it's still around. I actually don't even know. I don't know how it exists in Louisiana or if it exists in Louisiana. But so I won't ask the question. I'll just say it. When I was a teacher, the primary measurement of effective teaching was after your third year, you had a tenure portfolio. And that tenure portfolio was a compilation of artifacts, including lesson plans, observations, so on and so forth. And it was all, each artifact represented one or a series of behaviors that demonstrated your effectiveness as a teacher. All right. That compilation of artifacts, what does that measure?
Okay, I just thought of this, but maybe this is, it does not measure the simultaneous responses at the same time from the student and the teacher, that ongoing.
Good.
Right.
Yeah, no, it 100%, those artifacts say nothing about, they cannot in any way capture the student-teacher interaction that is a measure of contingency-shaped behavior, right? There's no way for me to turn in an artifact and have that demonstrate my effectiveness with a student in the moment. I might be able to turn in a graph and show pre-test and post-test and show growth over time, but it doesn't say anything about how long it took for me to get there. It doesn't say anything about my effectiveness. It doesn't say anything about the decisions that I made. It doesn't say anything about what it doesn't capture how I behaved as a teacher. It might represent a huge number of behaviors that taken as a whole were me as a teacher, but it doesn't represent what I did over time. If you look at the contingency-shaped repertoires, and hopefully this is a very challenging piece for supervisors to implement. But if you look at those over time, what you should see are a few different aspects. You should see that learning to criterion are supposed to go down. Total learning units are supposed to go up. Verbal behaviors should change over time. Those matrix repertoires, obviously, once you get one signed off, you don't do that one anymore. The progression through the contingency-shaped repertoires specifically demonstrates growth over a series of behaviors. And it's measured simultaneously and continuously. If you are measuring month to month to month to month, you don't just get to look at the final outcome. You have to look at the trend. You have to demonstrate that appropriate trend to show that you truly did get there. It's not okay for us to have poor learning criterion, poor learning criterion, poor learning criterion, month after month after month, and then just have one good month at the end. That snapshot isn't going to do it. You have to show continued growth, automaticity in your teacher behaviors in order to meet those ranks. So they're not artifacts because they are living, breathing measurements that are dynamic and completed as you are progressing. An artifact is just this moment in time, right? And it is not representative of growth. If I give you a point on a line, you don't know what direction that point is headed, what direction that line is headed. It's all about where are we going? Are we increasing our efficiency? Are we expanding those contingency shaped repertoires? All right.
So how do our ranks in the contingency, gosh, I can't say it now too, shape repertoires, how are they showing growth if we're switching clients, if we have multiple clients? Because each kid's different. So you might have an AIL child where LUC is super, super low, but then you might have another child that it's so high, and then you might have also just the programming that's not there or appropriate. Like there's multiple variables having an effect if it's not going to be consistent with the same kid.
Yeah. So one way to look at that, and that's actually something that I'm working with one of the BCBAs at Big on right now, is we're trying to be more objective about that. And I'm working on a database right now where we have some baseline levels, and we want to be able to say, okay, there are 3 listener speakers, 2 post-naming kids, and 1 early learner in your class. This is what your learning criterion should be. And we can kind of use objective data to wash all of that out. What you have to keep in mind is that I would say pre and post naming, there's actually, and we'll get into this in future weeks, but there's something akin to an optimal number of learning criteria. So you don't want, let's say for a kid before pre-naming, you don't want their learning criterion to be too low, because that means you're placing a ceiling on what they're learning. You don't want them to be too high because you're placing a floor on what they're learning. All right. There's definitely a Goldilocks number for learning criterion, regardless of VB. Okay. Keep in mind that objectives, and we're kind of getting off track a little bit, but I think it's worth discussing. STOs, which learning criterion measure, are subjective in nature. There's not one thing that defines an STO. An STO is not defined by 4 targets or 5 targets or 2 targets or 3 topographies. An STO is an amount of target operants that is appropriate for a child to learn in discrimination of one another. All right. So if I have 3 targets in an STO, I'm going to get X learning industry criterion. If I have 6 targets in an STO, I might get 2X learning industry criterion. I might get 4X learning industry criterion because the discrimination is that much more challenging. If I am teaching 5 operants, 5 targets, and I'm getting 1,000 learning industry criterion, I'm teaching too much. And maybe my STO should be 2 operants. Now, when you are solely addressing your contingency-shaped behavior, the contingency-shaped behavior is a measure of, given appropriate programs, my child learns at this rate. That given appropriate programs variable should not be part of the variable if you are just working on your contingency shaped behavior. If you are simultaneously working on your verbally mediated behavior, then it is a part of it. You see? So one does affect the other, but it's absolutely possible to say, I'm not going to do any programming for this classroom. I'm just going to work on my instruction, my contingency shaped behaviors. And I'm hoping that someone else has given me the appropriate instruction. If I'm not, what is your fallback? What's your backstop? What's there to protect you from not meeting those goals if programming is not appropriate? That should be part of your contingency shaped behavior. Decision protocol.
Decision protocol, thank you. Yeah.
If you are following the decision protocol, your learning criterion should not get astronomically high because there's this built-in stop. If you're missing decisions, then your learning criterion are going to go up because you're not emitting contingency shaped behavior. All right. So the contingency shaped behavior definitely, you're right, Taylor. It does rely on other variables, but as a measure, as a pure measure of your behavior, it all should fit together. That makes sense? I do think it is important for there to be some amount of consistency for some duration for the VB that you're working with, because you do need to show mastery over time. The teacher rank was designed for a classroom. Your kids remain the same throughout the school year. 10 modules, 10 months. That's how it's built. All right. So for a clinical setting, that might need to be manipulated a little bit. All right. It was a long-winded answer, but I think it was an important question to address. So what about verbally mediated behavior? What are the measures of verbally mediated behaviors that we have?
Still talking about the rank?
Mm-hmm.
Your data collections and data presentations.
Okay, good. Data collections and data presentations. Let's take it component by component. How are data presentations a measure of verbally mediated behavior?
You're able to talk about the data you're presenting along with the student, their current verbal behavior itself, what you're addressing, your target behavior, and be able to analyze the graph and explain what's going on.
Okay. My problem with that definition is that, to me, is using the presentation, is looking at the presentation as the behavior, not as the measure of the behavior. When you, let me ask it this way. When you're presenting your graph, is the verbally mediated behavior your presentation of the graph, or is your verbally mediated behavior all the decisions that were made that the graph represents? Is if I have a graph where I implemented a tactic, is verbally mediated behavior how I talk about the graph, or was it my decision making around the implementation of the tactic?
The decision making?
Yeah, I would agree. Now, little caveat, if someone else made the decision and that wasn't your behavior, then the presentation and your understanding of it has to become your verbally mediated behavior itself, verbally mediated behavior itself. But the decision making itself was the verbally mediated behavior. What behavior is the presentation? If the decision making that goes into the graph, I'll go one step further. You have three components. You have the decision making that goes into the graph, you have the graph, and you have the presentation. The decision making is the verbally mediated behavior. The graph is what?
I was thinking more of the contingency shape behavior.
That's your contingency shape behavior. What is the presentation?
The verbal behavior of the science?
That's your verbal behavior about the science. We just tied all three together. All right. Your ability to speak about something, we should be contingency shaped as the verbal behavior. Your thought process is the verbally mediated behavior. All right. Good. What about data collections? What behavior is that measuring? Let me ask it this way. What is the verbally mediated behavior in a data collection? And this is not an easy question. And we do not, as those who are in 501 this semester in particular will see, this becomes our focus, and it's not something that we always do a great job of getting to you guys. But what is the verbally mediated decision or behavior in a data collection?
It's being able to understand the science and apply it to the data that you're collecting and know if your tactics are working, what tactics you should choose or utilize to make changes.
So it's in there. It's there's one specific place. Say it again, Taylor.
The experimental design.
No, that is a form of verbally mediated behavior for you guys that will become contingency shaped behavior over time. So designs are that there's a static box that designs fit it, right? There is a totality that of design that you will learn. There are ways to combine designs that will constantly lead to some level of verbal mediation, which is really good. But before that, there's one inflection point where the behavior becomes verbally mediated. And I don't think you guys I'm gonna insult you guys without trying to insult you guys. But so I apologize in advance, but I don't think you're in the right mindset to be thinking of where the verbal mediation occurs. I will go so far as to say that there is a single paragraph in your data collection that defines your verbal mediation.
I was going to say the method when we actually apply it.
Nope.
The skill level, the graph ability or your skill level increases, or
nope. The last paragraph of your lit review.
What you're testing?
The inflection point between what all the research has said and how you synthesize that into your decision of what to do next. That's the verbally mediated behavior. That's the point at which you are taking all of the information. Now, remember, when it comes to data collection, this is why I was saying that I don't think we do a good job of getting you guys to this point. Data collections should not necessarily be, here's my kid, here's their problem, here's how I'm going to solve it. So now let me go find some research. That's backwards. It's here's my kid, here's my problem. Let me see what the research says, and now let me decide what I'm going to do. Right? So once when you've already decided what you're going to implement, that's not research. That's not a data, that is truly just collecting data and talking about it. That's figuring out what other people have said about what you are doing. Not what, yes, exactly, Tanya. So when you have to go to the research to solve your problem, the research has to guide that solution, right? And when you have put all the research together and you have synthesized the research into this one little idea and say, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm going to test, I think this synthesis solves my problem, that is verbally mediated behavior. And then you go and you test it. All right. The method section is totally contingency shaped. Your method section is see do, or see write, sorry. I see it happen, I write it down. I see it happen, I write it down. Your graphs are also see write. I put a plus, I saw it, I put a plus, I take a plus, I make a data point. Your discussion is another opportunity for verbal mediation. Your discussion is an opportunity for verbally mediated behavior. There's nothing, there is no singular behavior given a method section and graphs. There is no singular behavior that necessarily is going to occur as a result of that. So it can't be contingency shaped. There has to be analytics, there has to be problem solving that produces the discussion. All right, but not in the same way and not to the same degree as that singular paragraph. All right. If you leave the data collection paradigm and put it in an applied setting, you have your kid, You have your problem. You're not sure what to do with that problem. You go to your BCBA and you guys have a conversation. That conversation, the BCBA is going to ask you different questions. He or she's going to test little different thought processes. That's doing your research. And then once you've got all the information, they say, all right, this is the tactic that we're going to choose. That's a verbally mediated decision for your BCBA, and hopefully someday for you guys as well. It's the exact same idea as going through the literature, but it's that coming to that point where you decide what you're going to do that becomes your verbally mediated decision. So now, how does that verbal mediation feed back into the loop? How does that data collection, how do those decision analyses, how do those presentations feed back into the loop of verbal behavior and contingency shaped? Well, once you've done something once, should you be able to do it again? Test to see if it works under different contingencies. Appropriate application, absolutely. Once you've written your data collection, are you going to have to and use that data collection, use that research to help you understand the topic, understand the problem, understand how to apply that? Are you going to have to do that same level of research every time? No. It's going to become more automatic. Now, the behavior is in my repertoire. I can implement the tactic. Hopefully, I've acquired new verbal behavior, so I can speak about the tactic. And now it's just a matter of identifying which contingencies it's appropriate for. Oh, that worked here. That didn't work here. That goes away. That no longer, now I made a verbally mediated decision that that is not the right behavior for this set of contingencies. So I'm not going to use that anymore. That worked here. That becomes part of my contingency shaped behavior. All right. We get TPRAs, same idea. We're expanding our contingency shaped behavior. We get TPRAs on specific components of the matrix. We're expanding that contingency shaped behavior. We get stuck on something, we go to the research, we're using verbally mediated behavior. So on and so forth, and it keeps on growing. All right, so the ranks are these systematic measurements of what we believe are the critical components of effective teaching teachers as behavior analysts, or behavior analysts that are teachers. All right, the ranks measure these components. The ranks are not the behavior. They measure the behaviors, but the behaviors are what are learned over time. All three behaviors or repertoires are necessary. They each grow or are reinforced or expand independently, but they very quickly become intertwined. And they get to a point where there is a limit to how far, how wide any one of those can expand without support of the other. Application is the intersection of all three. An effective teacher must have all three. Effective teachers emit behavior. They apply those skills. You can't do one without the other. All right? Cool. Any questions? Any thoughts? Go back and look at your ranks. Go back and look at each of those repertoires, each of the the behaviors that are being measured on there, and make sure you understand what those behaviors are measuring. If you don't see how a component of the verbally mediated repertoire is measuring a verbally mediated behavior, let's talk about it. Let's have that conversation. All right. I think I know it's really important to understand what behaviors are being measured by the measurement tools. It's not just checking boxes, right? We're actually trying to get at something. We have to make sure that we actually do get to that point. All right, I'll leave it there for tonight. Any other thoughts? Feeling good about that? Too much to process? Process it later? All right, fair enough. Okay, so we're off next week, no class. There are still things that are kind of to be due, to be turned in. I'm fine. I'll make sure that Dr. Jean knows, and I'll communicate to the mentors that you don't have to have the week 5 stuff turned into them on Tuesday. That is totally fine. So if you're a couple days late getting that the quiz and the research summary to your mentors, that's no penalty there by any stretch. But when it comes to the data collection, be in communication with your mentors about when they're coming. If you have questions about what to do, really make sure that you're working with them. Okay. All right. Cool. Cece, BDS question. Go ahead and email me, and let's see if we can get it through that. Taylor, I'm going to jump off and then jump back on. Anyone else? Okay. All right. Cool. I'll see you guys in a few weeks. Have a good one.